We are all familiar with the four occupation zones of Germany, which were used by the four main victorious powers, the USA, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France, to divide up the whole of Germany after the Second World War. This was to ensure that Germany would never again go to war and that it would be weakened in the long term. The same applied to Austria, which was also divided up between the Allies. But as we know, the Second World War did not only take place in Europe. The Japanese Empire was involved in the brutal Pacific War, in which it conquered a large part of East Asia. It fought a fierce battle against the Allies, and the Second World War lasted even longer there than in Europe and only ended with the dropping of the 2 atomic bombs. But why wasn't Japan divided into occupation zones just like Germany? Why was the country treated relatively laxly compared to Germany, and why was it able to regain state sovereignty so quickly? We look at all these questions in today's video. Have fun! While May 8th is considered the end of the Second World War in Europe, the war in East Asia raged more fiercely than ever in the spring of 1945. But the Allies fighting there were not the same as those in Europe. The main opponents of the Japanese Empire were China, the USA, and the United Kingdom with its colonies Australia and New Zealand. As we can see, one of the most important allies, the Soviet Union, is missing here. The Soviet Union was not prepared for a war on two fronts, which is why all forces in Europe were pooled and a neutrality pact was negotiated with Japan in 1941. This was a particular thorn in the side of the USA, which vehemently urged the Soviet Union to open a second war front in East Asia to relieve the US troops. But Stalin remained stubborn and only promised to enter the Pacific War 3 months after a victory over Nazi Germany. And that is exactly what happened in the end. On August 8, 1945, exactly 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. But the starting position had changed in the meantime. The Americans had already done most of the work and pushed the Japanese far back. And a new wonder weapon had just been completed, the first atomic bomb. In addition, the difficulty of balancing the interests of the Western Allies and the Soviet Union was already becoming apparent in occupied Germany, and the Cold War was looming. In August 1945, the Americans were no longer so pleased about the Soviet Union's entry into the war, as it was clear that sooner or later they would also want a piece of Japan and that the division into occupation zones could open up a new front in the Cold War. Many historians today argue that this could also have been a reason for the rapid dropping of the atomic bombs. These were dropped on August 6th and 9th, shortly before and shortly after the Soviet Union entered the war. This quickly brought the Japanese to their knees, and less than a month later, Japan's surrender was signed. During this time, the Soviet Union was unable to achieve any significant victories and only played a minor role in the subsequent peace negotiations. The USA, with the help of the British, occupied Japan after the war, and the Soviet Union was only given a rather insignificant supervisory role within the Far Eastern Commission. Incidentally, this was the first time in Japan's modern history that it was occupied by a foreign power. However, the occupation was not to last too long and was nowhere near as extensive as in Germany. The USA did not interfere in the civil administration or society of the country, nor were there such strict occupation regulations as in Germany. Even the Japanese emperor was allowed to remain in office. Of course, he still had to agree to the constitution dictated by the USA, and there were also regulations on disarmament and democratization in Japan, but the occupation of the island nation is difficult to compare with the occupation of Germany. This was mainly due to the fact that the USA had learned from the mistakes made in Germany and wanted to rebuild Japan as quickly as possible in order to use it as a bulwark in the Cold War. Time was also pressing, as the first major battle of the Cold War began in 1950 with the Korean War. Japan regained full sovereignty through the San Francisco Peace Treaty, which was signed on September 8, 1951. As a condition, however, the American-Japanese Security Treaty had to be signed, which authorized the USA to occupy tens of thousands of soldiers and set up military bases throughout the country. However, Japan quickly got back on its feet thanks to the peace treaty and developed into one of the largest economic powers in the following decades. The disadvantage, however, was that the Second World War was virtually never dealt with in Japan, and it is still a difficult topic that people do not like to talk about. However, the lack of occupation zones made it possible to avoid a fiasco like the one in Germany, which was divided for decades and where there are still differences between East and West to this day.